create a European war, in the possibility of which I had not wanted to believe, and the reality of which I did not for a long time wish to acknowledge, had become a fact. We were in it, and I saw that it must be taken as a great memento mori, showing that hurry was necessary, and that it was impossible to believe in life which led nowhere. The war could not touch me personally, at any rate not until the final catastrophe, which seemed to me inevitable for Russia, and perhaps for the whole of Europe, but not yet imminent. Though then, of course, the approaching catastrophe looked only temporary, and no one had as yet conceived all the disintegration and destruction, both inner and outer, in which we should have to live in the future. Summing up the total of my impressions of the East, and particularly of India, I had to admit that, on my return, my problem seemed even more difficult and complicated than on my departure. India and the East had not only lost their glamour of the miraculous, on the contrary, this glamour had acquired new shades that were absent from it before. I saw clearly that something could be found there which had long since ceased to exist in Europe, and I considered that the direction I had taken was the right one. But, at the time, I was convinced that the secret was better and more deeply hidden than I could previously have supposed. When I went away, I already knew I was going to look for a school or schools. I had arrived at this long ago. I realised that personal, individual efforts were insufficient, and that it was necessary to come into touch with the real and living thought which must be in existence somewhere, but with which we had lost contact. This I understood. But the idea of schools itself changed very much during my travels, and in one way became simpler and more concrete, and in another way became more cold and distant. I want to say that schools lost much of their fairy tale character. On my departure, I still admitted much that was fantastic in relation to schools. Admitted is perhaps too strong a word. I should say better that I dreamed about the possibility of a non-physical contact with schools, a contact, so to speak, on another plane. I could not explain it clearly, but it seemed to me that even the beginning of contact with a school may have a miraculous nature. I imagined, for example, the possibility of making contact with schools of the distant past, with schools of Pythagoras, with schools of Egypt, with the schools of those who built Notre Dame, and so on. It seemed to me that the barriers of time and space should disappear on making such contact. The idea of schools in itself was fantastic, and nothing seemed to me too fantastic in relation to this idea, and I saw no contradiction between these ideas and my attempts to find schools in India. It seemed to me that it was precisely in India that it would be possible to establish some kind of contact which would afterwards become permanent and independent of any outside interferences. On the return journey, after a whole series of meetings and impressions, the idea of schools became much more real and tangible and lost its fantastic character. This probably took place chiefly because, as I then realised, school required not only a search, but selection or choice. I mean on our side. That schools existed I did not doubt, but at the same time I became convinced that the schools I heard about and with which I could have come into contact were not for me. They were schools of either a frankly religious nature or of a half-religious character, but definitely devotional in tone. These schools did not attract me, chiefly because if I had been seeking a religious way, I could have found it in Russia. Other schools were of a slightly sentimental, moral, philosophical type, with a shade of asceticism, like the schools of the disciples or followers of Ramakrishna. There were nice people connected with these schools, but I did not feel they had real knowledge. Others, which are usually described as yogi schools, and which are based on the creation of trance states, had, in my eyes, something of the nature of spiritualism. I could not trust them. All their achievements were either self-deception or what the orthodox mystics, I mean in Russian monastic literature, call beauty or allurement. There was another type of school with which I was unable to make contact and of which I only heard. These schools promised very much, but they also demanded very much. They demanded everything at once. It would have been necessary to stay in India and give up thoughts of returning to Europe, to renounce all my own ideas, aims and plans, and proceed along a road of which I could know nothing beforehand. These schools interested me very much, and the people who had been in touch with them and who told me about them stood out distinctly from the common type. But still, it seemed to me that there ought to be schools of a more rational kind, and that a man had the right, up to a certain point, to know where he was going. Simultaneously with this, I came to the conclusion that whatever the name of the school, occult, esoteric or yogi, they should exist on the ordinary earthly plane like any other kind of school, a school of painting, a school of dancing, a school of medicine. I realised that thought of schools on another plane was simply a sign of weakness, of dreams taking the place of real search. And I understood then that these dreams were one of the principal obstacles on our possible way to the miraculous. On the way to India, I made plans for further travels. This time, I wanted to begin with the Mohammedan East, chiefly Russian Central Asia and Persia, but nothing of this was destined to materialise. From London through Norway, Sweden and Finland, I arrived in Petersburg, already named Petrograd, and full of speculation and patriotism. Soon afterwards I went to Moscow and began editorial work for the newspaper to which I had written from India. I stayed there about 6 weeks, but during that time a little episode occurred, which was connected with many things that happened later. One day, in the office of the newspaper, I found, while preparing for the next issue, a notice, in I think the Voice of Moscow, referring to the scenario of a ballet, The Struggle of the Magicians, which belonged, as it said, to a certain Hindu. The action of the ballet was to take place in India and give a complete picture of Oriental magic, including fakir miracles, sacred dances, and so on. I did not like the excessively jaunty tone of the paragraph, but as Hindu writers of ballet scenarios were, to a certain extent, rare in Moscow, I cut it out and put it into my paper, with the slight addition that there would be everything in the ballet that cannot be found in real India, but which travellers go there to see. Soon after this, for various reasons, I left the paper and went to Petersburg. There, in February and March 1915, I gave public lectures on my travels in India. The titles of these lectures were In Search of the Miraculous and The Problems of Death. In these lectures, which were to serve as an introduction to a book on my travels it was my intention to write, I said that in India the miraculous was not sought where it ought to be sought, that all ordinary ways were useless, and that India guarded her secrets better than many people supposed, but that the miraculous did exist there and was indicated by many things which people pass by without realising their hidden sense and meaning, or without knowing how to approach them. I again had schools in mind. In spite of the war, my lectures evoked very considerable interest. There was more than 1,000 people at each in the Alexandrovsky Hall of the Petersburg Town Duma. I received many letters. People came to see me, and I felt that on the basis of a search for the miraculous, it would be possible to unite together a very large number of people who were no longer able to swallow the customary forms of lying, living and lying. After Easter, I went to give these lectures in Moscow. Among people whom I met during these lectures there were two, one a musician and the other a sculptor, who very soon began to speak to me about a group in Moscow which was engaged in various occult investigations and experiments, and directed by a certain G, a Caucasian Greek, the very Hindu, so I understood, to whom belonged the ballet scenario mentioned in the newspaper I'd come across 3 or 4 months before this. I must confess that what these two people told me about this group, and what took place in it, all sorts of self-suggestive wonders, interested me very little. I had heard tales exactly like this many times before, and I formed a definite opinion concerning them. Ladies who suddenly see eyes in their rooms which float in the air, fascinate them, and which they street to street, and at the end arrive at the house of a certain Oriental to whom the eyes belong, or people who, in the presence of the same Oriental, suddenly feel he is looking right through them, seeing all their feelings, thoughts and desires, and they have a strange sensation in their legs, cannot move, and then fall into his power to such an extent that he can make them do everything he desires, even from a distance. All this, and many other stories of the same sort, it always seemed to me to be simply bad fiction. People invent miracles for themselves, and invent exactly what is expected from them. It is a mixture of superstition, self-suggestion, and defective thinking, and, according to my observation, these stories never appear without a certain collaboration on the part of the men to whom they refer. So that, in the light of previous experience, it was only after the persistent efforts of one of my new acquaintances, M, that I agreed to meet G and have a talk with him. My first meeting of him entirely changed my opinion of him and of what I might expect from him. I remember this meeting very well. We arrived at a small cafe in a noisy though not central street. I saw a man of an Oriental type, no longer young, with a black moustache and piercing eyes, who astonished me first of all because he seemed to be disguised and completely out of keeping with the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man with the face of an Indian Raja or an Arab sheikh, who might once seem to see in a white burnoose or a gilded turban, seated here in this little cafe where small dealers and commission agents met together, in a black overcoat with a velvet collar and a black bowler hat, produced the strange, unexpected, and almost alarming impression of a man poorly disguised, the sight of whom embarrasses you because you see he is not what he pretends to be, and yet you have to speak and behave as though you did not see it. He spoke Russian incorrectly with a strong Caucasian accent, and this accent, with which we are accustomed to associate anything apart from philosophical ideas, strengthened still further the strangeness and the unexpectedness of this impression. I do not remember how our talk began. I think we spoke of India, of esotericism, and of yogi schools. I gathered that G had travelled widely and had been in places of which I had only heard, and which I very much wished to visit. Not only did my questions not embarrass him, but it seemed to me that he would put much more into each answer than I had asked for. I liked his manner of speaking, which was careful and precise. M soon left us. G told me of his work in Moscow. I did not fully understand him. It transpired from what he said that in his work, which was chiefly psychological in character, chemistry played a big part. Listening to him for the first time, I, of course, took his words literally. What you say, I said, reminds me of something I heard about a school in southern India. A Brahmin, an exceptional man in many respects, told a young Englishman in Travancore of a school which studied the chemistry of the human body, and by means of introducing or removing various substances, could change a man's moral and psychological nature. This is very much like what you are saying. It may be so, said G, but at the same time it may be quite different. There are schools which appear to make use of similar methods but understand them quite differently. A similarity of methods or even of ideas proves nothing. There is another question that interests me very much, I said. There are substances which yogis take to induce certain states. Might these not be, in certain cases, narcotics? I have myself carried out a number of experiments in this direction, and everything I've read about magic proves to me quite clearly that all schools at all times and in all countries have made a very wide use of narcotics for the creation of those states which make magic possible. Yes, said G. In many cases, these substances are those which you call narcotics, but they can be used in entirely different ways. There are schools which make use of narcotics in the right way. People in these schools take them for self-study, in order to take a look ahead, to know their possibilities better, to see beforehand, in advance, what can be attained later on as the result of prolonged work. When a man sees this, and is convinced that what he has learned theoretically really exists, he then works consciously. He knows where he is going. Sometimes this is the easiest way of being convinced of the real existence of those possibilities which man often suspects in himself. There is a special chemistry relating to this. There are particular substances for each function. Each function can either be strengthened or weakened, awakened or put to sleep. But to do this, a great knowledge of the human machine and of this special chemistry is necessary. In all those schools which make use of this method, experiments are carried out only when they are really necessary, and only under the direction of experienced and competent men who can foresee all results and adopt measures against possible undesirable consequences. The substances used in these schools are not merely narcotics, as you call them, although many of them are prepared from such drugs as opium, hashish, and so on. Besides schools in which such experiments are carried out, there are other schools which use these or similar substances, not for experiment or study, but to attain definite desired results, if only for a short time. Through a skillful use of such substances, a man can be made very clever or very strong for a certain time. Afterwards, of course, he dies or goes mad, but this is not taken into consideration. Such schools also exist. So you see that we must speak very cautiously about schools. They may do practically the same things, but the results will be totally different. I was very deeply interested in everything G said. I felt in it some new points of view, unlike any I had met with before. He invited me to go with him to a house where some of his pupils were to foregather. We took a carriage and went in the direction of Sokolniki. On the way, G told me how the war had interfered with many of his plans. Many of his pupils had gone with the first mobilization. Very expensive apparatus and instruments ordered from abroad had been lost. Then he spoke of the heavy expenditure connected with his work, of the expensive apartments he had taken, into which, I gathered, we were going. He said, further, that his work interested a number of well-known people in Moscow, professors and artists, as he expressed it. But when I asked him who, precisely, they were, he did not give me a single name. I ask, I said, because I'm a native of Moscow, and besides, I have worked on newspapers here for 10 years, so that I know more or less everybody. G said nothing to this. We came to a large empty flat over a municipal school, evidently belonging to teachers of this school. I think it was in the place of the former Red Pond. There were several of G's pupils in the flat, 3 or 4 young men and 2 ladies, both of whom looked like schoolmistresses. I had been in such flats before. Even the absence of furniture confirmed my idea, since municipal schoolmistresses were not given furniture. With this thought, it somehow became strange to look at G. Why had he told me that tale about the enormous expenditure connected with this flat? In the first place, the flat was not his. In the second place, it was rent-free. And thirdly, it could not have cost more than £10 a month. There was something so singular in this obvious bluff that I thought at that time it must mean something. It is difficult for me to reconstruct the beginning of the conversation with G's pupils. Some of the things I heard surprised me. I tried to discover in what their work consisted, but they gave me no direct answers, insisting in some cases on a strange and, to me, unintelligible terminology. They suggested reading the beginning of a story written, so they told me, by one of G's pupils, who was not in Moscow at the time. Naturally, I agreed to this, and one of them began to read aloud from a manuscript. The author described his meeting and acquaintance with G. My attention was attracted by the fact that the story began with the author coming across the same notice of the ballet, The Struggle of the Magicians, which I myself had seen in The Voice of Moscow in the winter. Further, this pleased me very much because I expected it. At the first meeting, the author certainly felt that G put him, as it were, on the palm of his hand, weighed him, and put him back. The story was called Glimpses of Truth, and was evidently written by a man without any literary experience. But in spite of this, it produced an impression, because it contained indications of a system in which I felt something very interesting, though I could neither name nor formulate it to myself, and some very strange and unexpected ideas about art, which found in me a very strong response. I later learned on that the author of the story was an imaginary person, and that the story had been begun by two of G's pupils who were present at the reading, with the object of giving an exposition of his ideas in a literary form. Still later I heard that the idea of the story belonged to G himself. The reading of what constituted the first chapter stopped at this point. G listened attentively the whole time. He sat on a sofa with one leg tucked beneath him, drinking black coffee from a tumbler, smoking and sometimes glancing at me. I liked his movements, which had a great deal of a kind of feline grace and assurance. Even in his silence there was something which distinguished him from others. I felt that I would rather have met him, not in Mescal, not in his flat, but in one of those places from which I had so recently returned, in the court of one of the Cairo mosques, in one of the ruined cities of Ceylon, or in one of the South Indian temples, Tanjore, Trichinopoly, or Madura. "Well, how do you like the story?" asked G after a short silence when the reading had ended. I told him I found it interesting to listen to, but that, from my point of view, it had the defect of not making clear what exactly it was all about. The story spoke of a very strong impression produced upon the author by a doctrine he had met with, but it gave no adequate idea of the doctrine itself. Those who were present began to argue with me, pointing out that I had missed the most important point of it. G himself said nothing. When I asked what was the system they were studying and what were its distinguishing features, I was answered very indefinitely. Then they spoke of work on oneself, but in what this work consisted they failed to explain. On the whole, my conversation with G's pupils did not go very well, and I felt something calculated and artificial in them, as though they were playing a part learned beforehand. Besides, the pupils did not match with the teacher. They all belonged to that particular layer of Moscow, rather poor intelligentsia, which I knew very well, and from which I could not expect anything interesting. I even thought that it was very strange to meet them on the way to the miraculous. At the same time, they all seemed to me quite nice and decent people. The stories I had heard from Ed obviously did not come from them, and did not refer to them. "There is one thing I wanted to ask you," said G after a pause. "Could this article be published in a paper? We thought that we could acquaint the public in this way with our ideas." "It is quite impossible," I said. "This is not an article, that is, not anything having a beginning and an end. It is the beginning of a story, and it is too long for a newspaper. You see, we count material by lines. The reading occupied 2 hours. It is about 3,000 lines. You know what we call a feuilleton in a paper. An ordinary feuilleton is about 300 lines. So this part of the story will take 10 feuilletons. In Moscow papers, a feuilleton or continuation is never printed more than once a week. So it will take 10 weeks, and it is a conversation of one night. If it can be published, it is only in a monthly magazine, but I don't know anyone suitable for this now. And in this case, they were asked the whole story before they say anything." G did not say anything, and the conversation stopped at that. But in G himself I at once felt something uncommon, and in the course of the evening this impression only strengthened. When I was taking leave of him, the thought flashed into my mind that I must at once, without delay, arrange to meet him again, and that if I did not do so I might lose all connection with him. I asked him if I could not see him once more before my departure to Petersburg. He told me that he would be at the same cafe the following day at the same time. I came out with one of the young men. I felt myself very strange. A long reading which I very little understood. People who did not answer my questions. G himself with his unusual manners and his influence on his people, which I all the time felt produced in me an unexpected desire to laugh, to shout, to sing, as though I had escaped from school or from strange detention. I wanted to tell my impressions to this young man, make some jokes about G, and about the rather tedious, pretentious story. I at once imagined myself telling all this to some of my friends. Happily, I stopped myself in time. But he will go and telephone them at once. They are all friends. So I tried to keep myself in hand. Quite silently, we came to the tram and rode towards the centre of Moscow. After rather a long journey, we arrived at Okny Nad, near which place I stayed, and silently said goodbye to one another, parted. I was at the same cafe where I met G the next day, and the day following, and every day afterwards. During the week I spent in Moscow, I saw G every day. It very soon became clear to me that he knew very much of what I wanted to know. Among other things, he explained to me certain phenomena I had come across in India, which no one had been able to explain to me either there, on the spot, or afterwards. In his explanations, I felt the assurance of a specialist, a very fine analysis of facts, and a system which I could not grasp, but the presence of which I already felt because G's explanations made me think not only of the facts under discussion, but also of many other things I had observed or conjectured. I did not meet G's group again. About himself, G spoke but little. Once or twice he mentioned his travels in the East. I was interested to know where he had been, but this I was unable to make out exactly. In regard to his work in Moscow, G said that he had two groups unconnected with one another and occupied in different work, according to the state of their preparation and their powers, as he expressed it. Each member of these groups paid 1,000 rubles a year and was able to work with him while pursuing his ordinary activities in life. I said that in my opinion, 1,000 rubles a year might be too large a payment for many people without private means. G replied that no other arrangement was possible because, owing to the very nature of the work, he could not have many pupils. At the same time, he did not desire, and ought not, he emphasised this, to spend his own money on the organisation of the work. His work was not, and could not be, of a charitable nature, and his pupils themselves ought to find the means of the hire of apartments where they could meet, for carrying out experiments and so on. Besides this, he added that observation showed that people who were weak in life proved themselves weak in the work. There are several aspects of this idea, said G. The work of each person may involve expenses, travelling, and so on. If his life is so badly organised that 1,000 rubles embarrasses him, it would be better for him not to undertake this work. Suppose that, in the course of the year, his work requires him to go to Cairo or some other place. He must have the means to do so. Through our demand, we find out whether he is able to work with us or not. Besides, G continued, I have far too little spare time to be able to sacrifice it on others without being certain even that it will do them good. I value my time very much because I need it for my own work and because I cannot and, as I said before, do not want to spend it unproductively. There is also another side to this, G said. People do not value a thing if they do not pay for it. I listened to this with a strange feeling. On the one hand, I was pleased with everything that G said. I was attracted by the absence of any element of sentimentality, of conventional talk about altruism, of words about working for the good of humanity, and so forth. On the other hand, I was surprised at G's apparent desire to convince me of something in connection with the question of money when I needed no convincing. If there was anything I did not agree with, it was simply that G would be able to collect enough money in the way he described. I realised that none of those pupils whom I had seen would be able to pay 1,000 rubles a year. If he'd really found in the East visible and tangible traces of hidden knowledge, and was continuing investigations in this direction, then it was clear that this work needed funds, like any other scientific enterprise, like an expedition into some unknown part of the world, the excavation of an ancient city, or an investigation requiring elaborate and numerous physical or chemical experiments. It was quite unnecessary to convince me of this. On the contrary, the thought was already in my mind that if G gave me the possibility of a closer acquaintance with his activities, I should probably be able to find